Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about some important type terms. Now there's a huge catalog of type terms or terminology around typography and drawing letter forms, so we're going to scale ours down to words around letter forms and words about letter forms. They're also going to be a just narrow enough framework that you can understand these terms, and we'll start to use them as we draw letter forms, so don't feel the need to memorize them right away, because by the time we're done with this typeface, they should be second nature. First, we'll start with the words around letter forms. I've got a set of letters here so that we can look at all these things as they come up. The first one we're going to start with is the baseline. The baseline is the line right across the bottom where all of our letter forms stand astute. It gives us our unity, and it's where all of our letters will sit as we draw them going forward. The second type term is going to be our x height. Now I don't have a lowercase x here, but I do have a lowercase n, and you can see in that lowercase n, the x height is the height of that straight bar. Now that straight stroke right down the middle there is as tall as our lowercase letter forms go. So this is fundamental to our lowercase letter forms. The cap height, line number 3, is the height of the capital H, and that descends to all other capital letters. So when we're drawing our capital letter forms, we're going to use that cap height as an indicator of how tall to draw those. Already with these 3 lines, we have a lot of DNA for our typeface. The relationship between the baseline, the x height, and the cap height determine how our letter forms are going to look and overall feel of them, especially in text. There are certain relationships and certain proportions we might want when we're setting text type versus when we're setting display type. So you can decide how extreme you want the difference between those two. Next, line number 4 will be our ascender line. Now in a lot of sans serif and modern typefaces, our ascender line shares that of the cap height, but in reading text, it's oftentimes a little bit higher than our cap height. You can check this when you typeset the word the, capital T-H-E, will show us the difference between the capital T and how high our ascender goes on our lowercase h. That relationship helps us distinguish some of those capital letter forms from lowercase, especially when we're reading. Fifth, we'll talk about the descender. Our letter forms like a lowercase p and a lowercase q really show off the descender. Here I've got a lowercase g, where you can see the another relationships between our x height and how low our letter forms go. This set of 5 lines here shows us some consistency in the letter forms. We use these so that we can make our letter forms consistent. Now you might have noticed while I've been putting these lines up that there's some difference between where some of these straight lines end and where some of the curves end. The N is a great example. The first stroke of the lowercase n sits perfectly between our baseline and our x height. But that curved part of the N just goes over that x height. This is called overshoot. We use overshoot in our curved letter forms to help us offset visually the difference between curved lines and straight lines. If, for example, we only used our strict lines to scale the size of our capital O or lowercase o, they would look much smaller compared to the capital H or the lowercase n. So those characters need to be just a little bit bigger, and they need a little bit of overshoot. So we set this overshoot in our documents, and it'll help us correct visually what might otherwise run astray. Finally, and this is particular to type design, we'll talk about side bearings. In this first letter form here, you'll see that there's side bearings on the left and side bearings on the right. This is the space between letter forms. So when we add one letter form's side bearings to another, you get some space between the 2 letter forms. In Glyphs, we're able to set those side bearings and decide how much space comes between our letter forms in a process called spacing. Once we set our side bearings over the whole array of letter forms, you can see how our spacing comes together and how it comes out of these simple things called left and right side bearings. So those are some simple terms around the letter forms. Notice we didn't talk anything about the actual letter forms, just some of the grids and some of the things that are going on around the letter forms. Next, let's talk about some actual components about the letter forms. Mid-roll time. Be sure to like and subscribe to the video if you haven't already. It's going to be the best way to support these videos so I can keep putting them out and keep making them free to access. Alright, back. What you're looking at are a plethora of typefaces to help us talk about some of these terms. First there's Garamond and then Proxima Nova. These are two very different typefaces. Then we have White Inktrap, and finally Source Serif, which we'll use to talk about some other things at the end. One of the first terms we will talk about is axis. If you remember from the drawing and sketching process, we annotated an axis based off of the angle of our pen. When we're drawing a typeface, that axis becomes very important, whether we're using a vertical axis or an axis at an angle. In Garamond, it's quite easy to see where that axis lies, versus in Proxima Nova, where it's straight up and down and just there for a nuance of visual cues. Second, we'll talk about contrast. Again, looking at Adobe Garamond, you can see how thick the thicks are and how thin the very thin strokes are. That has a high contrast, versus a typeface like Proxima Nova or many other of our grotesque sans serif typefaces that have a smaller contrast. I want to note here though that there is a contrast between those horizontal strokes, the strokes running left to right, and the vertical strokes, the up and down strokes. Those are just optical adjustments so that these letter forms still look the same, but they function just a little bit different, and when we design our typefaces, we'll do similar things. Third, we'll talk about counters. Our counters are the negative spaces in the letter forms. There's some nuance in between counters and white space or negative space, so we're just going to name it as any of these sort of things here, but it's important to note that we will be working on our counters as actively as we work on our positive shapes. Sometimes I think the counters get overlooked, and they ought to be just as beautiful as the exterior shape. The two really combine to make our letter forms. Fourth, we'll talk about ink traps. Now, if you're familiar with ABC Dynamo and White Inktrap, it's earned its fame by really exaggerating the ink traps. Now, they're not the first to do this, but it's easy to see in this demo here what an ink trap is. Originally, when type was hand cut out of metal and set on linen paper with poor ink, there were a number of contributors to some poor readability. One, that the metal would get soft and it would deteriorate over time. Two, the paper bled. And three, the ink sort of ran. So the ink traps are negative spaces cut out of letter forms so that once the ink swells, it fills in those ink traps and looks like a normal letter form. Versus if a type or letter didn't have an ink trap and it continued to swell, then it would look rounded or soft. There are many letter forms and many typefaces that have ink traps. Many of them are just more subtle than the example I've used here. 5, and this is hopefully an obvious one, are serifs. Serifs really come out of the writing process where we're trying to add a really nice, crisp terminal to our letter forms. They also help distinguish some letters from others, and so we'll look at that as we draw some serif letter forms. Number 6, we're looking at a stem. That's also, we'll talk about that as the vertical stroke quite frequently. And 7th, we'll talk about terminals. The terminal is that sort of outstroke when we look at letter forms. Here we're looking at in the lowercase e, but we'll want to be consistent when we think about our terminals in the lowercase e, c, s, a, all of these other letter forms that have that sort of end that's not a serifed end, but a terminal. So those are some terms to get us started. We'll use those quite frequently, and like I said, by the end of this course, you'll be so familiar with these, you'll use them in modern language and won't even recognize the difference. Thanks again for liking the video. As always, please make sure you're subscribed and that you like the video so we can keep pushing these forward. If you've already done that, share them, comment on them, just spread the design love everywhere.